Well, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Ambuske of the Washington Library Center for Digital History. Thanks so much for joining us for our latest Ford Evening Book Talk. Now, you may be asking yourself, well, how is this an evening book talk? As a wise man once said, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And in this case, it's 5 p.m. in Great Britain from where our guest is joining us today. And we thank the Ford Motor Company, as always, for their long, ongoing support of this program. Now, before we dive into a fascinating discussion about the wider dimensions of the revolutionary Atlantic world, I do want to let you know that we've got a great September planned for you. We've got some great programs coming up featuring historians and scholars like Nathaniel Philbrick, Andrew O'Shaughnessy, and Carolyn Eastman, just to name a few. We've got great events like more Ford Evening Book Talks, our Founding Debates series, and some other things coming down the pike. These will be hybrid events, so please join us in person or online as your schedule allows. And you can learn more about these programs and other upcoming events by going to mountvernon.org/GW Digital Talks. Now, for tonight's main event, or this afternoon's main event, in the summer of 1776, as many of us know, American patriots in New York City celebrated the Declaration of Independence, but that was kind of the high point of that summer. In the ensuing months, American forces under George Washington lost much of the city, lost much of Lower Manhattan and the surrounding region to a British invasion force during that period. And there were two brothers, General William Howe and Admiral Lord Richard Howe, who were at the head of that invasion force, and they handed George Washington a near catastrophic defeat from which the Continental Army barely recovered. Now, the Howe brothers tend to get all of the attention, but they were but two members of a powerful British family with deep ties to British America long before the Revolution, a family that included their prolific sister Caroline. Today, I am delighted that we have Dr. Julia Flavell to join us and tell us more about the fascinating Howe family. Dr. Flavell is a historian. She is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, the previous author of a very important book, When London Was Capital of America. And she joins us now to discuss her most recent book, The Howe Dynasty, the Untold Story of a Military Family and the Women Behind Britain's Wars for America. Just you can see it here, and it's just out from Live Right Press. Julie, welcome to the program. Thanks so much for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here.
I happen to actually be in my office here today at the Washington Library in Northern Virginia. Where do we find you today?
Well, I'm in our drawing room, as it were, in our house in Dundee, Scotland, the library. Library and games room.
Very nice. And is it? We've got some scorching heat here. I suppose it's probably the proper Scottish weather at this point. Nice and
actually, it's a beautiful day. Not scorching heat. It's perfect weather. So excellent. Unfortunately, I'm stuck indoors at the moment, as I told you, because I've been told by the National Health to isolate for 10 days. I think I was on a flight with somebody who had COVID. So, but I'm perfectly well.
Oh, good.
I'm just in the good weather.
I'm sorry you're locked indoors, but I'm glad that you can join us today, and I look forward to talking about your book with you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's get started. As I said at the top of the program today, and I do want to remind folks that you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of Julie over Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube over the course of our conversation. But as I said at the top of the head, most viewers may be familiar with General William or Lord Richard Howe, the two men who headed the invasion force in 76 and were prominent in the early years of the American Revolution. But I think it's probably fair to say they know less about the rest of the Howe dynasty. Would you introduce us to the family at the center of your book and tell us something about their place in 18th century British society?
Yes, absolutely. The Howes were minor aristocracy. They'd actually been climbing up in the ranks of the aristocracy since the 17th century when John Howe, a wealthy solicitor, married the illegitimate daughter of the Earl of Sunderland and acquired an estate in Nottinghamshire. By the beginning of the 18th century, his son Scrope Howe had attained a title. He was Viscount, first Viscount Howe. Scrope Howe was the grandfather of the characters I read about, Caroline and her brothers. But the Viscountcy was only an Irish Viscountcy, so the Howes were not in the House of Lords. Scrope Howe was elected to the House of Commons. And his son, Scrope Howe, the second Viscount Howe, then married extremely well. And if you'll bring up the portrait of Charlotte von Kielmansegg. Yes, he married Charlotte von Kielmansegg in 1719. Now, Charlotte von Kielmansegg is a very interesting person.
Mm-hmm.
She was the daughter of the illegitimate half-sister of King George I. Horace Walpole thought she was the illegitimate daughter of George I. She was not. Her parents were married. Her father was a courtier in the court of Hanover. She was born in Hanover. She came over to England in 1714 with George I. Her entire family did. And in 1719, she married Scrope Howe, second Viscount Howe. She was 16 and he was 20. So it was a very, very advantageous match for him, marrying into somebody with royal connections. And this is her at 8. This is a wedding portrait. And you can see that she's got her little dog. The Howes were all dog lovers. And the story about General Howe having his dog returned after the Battle of Germantown is absolutely true. And although it was it was a marriage that satisfied all of the family's ambitions, it was also a love match. So in 16 years of marriage, Scrope and Charlotte had 10 children. Scrope died in 1735 when he was acting as governor of Barbados. And that left Charlotte in the position of having 8 living children, 4 boys and 4 girls. The oldest girl was Caroline, who features so much in my book. She was 14 at the time, and there was also an infant. So Charlotte returned to England. Now, the Howes actually had financial difficulties. They didn't really have a huge estate by the standards of the aristocracy. And of course, the ages of the children meant that the usual way for families of this kind to augment their income, which is by getting some kind of high-paying post, whether in the service or for the crown, was impossible because at that point, their son George was only 11. He was the oldest boy. So there was a period of about 10 years when the Howe family, the fortunes of the Howe family were managed really by the Howe women. And so if you could show the next picture, please. The picture, sorry. Yes, thank you. That's great. Okay, this picture, I was really thrilled to find this picture in the home of the present day Lord Howe. This is Mary Countess Pembroke, and she was, I don't think it's been reproduced anywhere. I was able to reproduce it for my book. Wow. Mary was the brother of Scrope Howe, the Howe who died in Barbados. Sorry, the sister of Scrope Howe, the Howe who died in Barbados. She had served at court under Princess Caroline, who later became Queen Caroline. And when she was about 24 years of age, she married the ancient Earl of Pembroke, definitely a marriage for position and money. She was his third wife. And this is a picture of her, again, a wedding portrait. And you can see that she's got peer's robes on. She's holding a peer's coronet. She looks immensely pleased with herself. Now, Lady Pembroke, she was known as Lady Pembroke for the rest of her life as a courtesy title, even though the Earl died some years after their marriage. She is an example of an outstanding example of a Georgian phenomenon of politically involved aristocratic women. During an era when about 10,000 families in Britain controlled all the politics, it's no surprise that proximity meant power. Mm. So there were aristocratic women who used their proximity to powerful men to manage reputations, to obtain posts for people, and even to affect policy in some ways. And Lady Pembroke was a very good example of this. And she had a very strong influence on Caroline. She maintained her position at court, and she proceeded to look after the family. As I say, she became virtually the head of the family at a time when there were no men who were in the right age. All the men were minors. And she obtained a position at court for Lady Howe, for Charlotte Howe, the mother. She became a lady in waiting to Princess Augusta, who was the mother of George III. she got both William and George, the sons, started in their military careers. And she also did something that was a little bit regarded as a little bit questionable in those days, which was, of course, her brother, Scrope, who died in Barbados, had been an MP for Nottinghamshire. And the Howes regarded this seat in Parliament as their own. But of course, George couldn't possibly enter. He was too young. So she installed her second very obedient husband, Jack Mordaunt, in the parliamentary seat. And the idea was that he'd obligingly step aside when George came of age, which he did do. So she really kind of tutored Caroline and her mother in this kind of feminine exercise of power from behind the scenes.
Can I ask you a follow-up question, Julie? In this period, as you said, women were proximity to power, but there's also this idea that women weren't supposed to meddle directly in politics. And so do you see examples where they are crossing the boundaries that society has set for them in this instance?
Yeah, and of course, the most famous instance of that is later in the century, the Duchess of Devonshire, who was going around kissing people in order to help Charles James Fox electioneer, and that caused a huge newspaper outcry, and she was branded as, immodest and all kinds of other insulting things. But the attitude during the period was that as long as women were using their power and influence in the service of their family, it was accepted. Mm. And some families had a tradition of women who did this, and the Howes were one of them. So the women were kind of raised to think, that this was part of what they did. They didn't simply get married and produce offspring. They involved themselves in the family's fortunes. And so I think, yes, they were very much in that tradition.
And so you've got a family who's well connected to court, which is very politically advantageous. And then it sounds like the younger sons and the younger family members benefited from this as they rose into the 18th century then.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, Caroline had a lifelong friendship with Princess Amelia, who was the aunt of George III. They both loved cards and dogs. And they always kept close to the court. Some of them had positions at court. Caroline never did, but they at least were friends with people at court. And I think that in particular, the mother, Charlotte Howe, she was close friends with George II's mistress. And that's something that Lady Yarmouth, and that's something that really hasn't been recognized by court historians and biographers of George II. But she actually was quite close friends with her, and that gave the Howes a lot of power. And she actually traveled to Germany with Lady Yarmouth in 1764. She was the only courtier who went with her.
Oh, wow.
German speaking. So.
And you call them the Howe dynasty. What makes a dynasty? The dynasty in the United States might reference the soap opera my grandmother's watched a long time ago, but that's we're talking about something completely different. Yeah.
Well, in a way, it's fair enough. You could refer to the Bush dynasty if you wanted to. I mean, a dynasty, generally speaking, is a prominent, powerful family that maintains its position for several generations. And to use a modern terminology, it acquires a brand. So the various family members are recruited into, maintaining this brand, as the Howes definitely were. And in Georgian England, a dynasty would typically own a country seat, lands in an estate, and hopefully a title. Not always. It wasn't necessary.
Well, I'm excited to talk more about some of the individual members of this dynasty here in just a moment. We do have one question that came in over Twitter about a week ago. Alec Rogers wanted to know how you actually conceived of this topic. As we've been talking about a little bit, we know a lot about Richard and William, but Charlotte, Caroline, other family members are less familiar to us. And he describes this such as an exciting and rich way to look at the same old story. How did you come to this topic?
Okay, that's interesting. Well, I always thought the Howes were kind of interesting. I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, so I was always hearing stories about the War of Independence, and the Howes were always vaguely presented as, there was always this family dimension to them. They weren't just commanders in chief in the Revolution. It was two brothers. And it was mentioned that they were fighting in part because they didn't want to feel that the loss of their brother George in America had been for nothing. You know, they wanted Britain and the colonies to maintain a fruitful tie. And at the same time, there have always been these kind of conspiracy theories swirling around them, which I think are related to that idea of there being some kind of predilection on their part towards the colonies, that they were soft on the American army. And of course, anybody who's read about the War of Independence has at least had a brush with those ideas. And so I always thought they were an interesting family. There's something a little romantic and intriguing about them. But of course, it's said time and time again in the history books that the Howe's papers were destroyed in a fire in the 1820s in Ireland. And so they're a closed book. And so they're always presented as mysterious. And as well as being mysterious, by the way, all their papers are destroyed. So that's it, folks. And I've actually I've sometimes thought that military historians are a little bit relieved. You know, they quickly write that, and they do usually. They mention that. Yeah. They'll quickly write that and then turn with relief to official dispatches or whatever they'd rather look at. So the way I got involved in the book was that I was going to write a sequel to When London Was Capital of America and write about London during the American War of Independence. So I knew that the correspondence between Caroline Howe and her very close friend, Lady Georgia Spencer, in the British Library, had a lot about the London scene in the Revolution. It's actually correspondence that hasn't been exhaustively mined. It's not even foliated. It's just in a bunch of boxes, but people have dipped into it for various things. And so I decided to have a look at it. And I just thought, actually, there's loads to find out about the family in these papers. I mean, Caroline just sort of tells it all. I mean, they don't have to be mysterious, but you do have to go look at the sisters' papers to get the answers. So then I completely changed my mind. I thought, no, I'm going to write a biography of the Howe family. It's going to be the first ever biography. And I've found it really intriguing and enjoyable. And it is good to move in, to just open up a whole nother mine of narrative about the War of Independence, a war that's covered, quite deservedly so exhaustively, just to get a richer, more in-depth look on the issues, the people involved.
Well, with full understanding that archivists are overworked and have too much to do, what do you think accounts for the fact that these letters of Caroline were unfoliated or not in folders and in boxes and really not exploited to the extent that they could have been in previous generations?
I don't know about why the papers haven't been. I mean, they are perfectly usable. The boxes are numbered, and I've just had to put the dates in since they aren't foliated. They're perfectly accessible. I know that they used to belong to the Spencer family, and they've been donated to the British Library. So I don't know how long the British Library has had to, work with them. But I think they've been regarded as women's material. So although military historians or historians of the War of Independence dip into them for particular dates, it doesn't occur to them to, read them letter after letter after letter and look at the whole environment that's being projected in the letters. So they've really been she's been neglected, but, she's been overlooked as a potential source for the brothers' attitudes and feelings towards their career. But I have to say that I don't think the brothers would agree with that. I don't think they'd see Caroline as, a minor person in their lives or somebody who, didn't have any insights into their professional views on things. And I started out by talking about how the aunts, particularly Lady Pembroke, but there was another aunt as well who had connections in the East India Company. She was the one who launched Richard's career because he started off in the Merchant Marine. That these women were the family managers for a while. And I find the Howes seem to have a very egalitarian relationship within the family between the men and the women. They really were a team. And I think probably their background is part of the reason why. But it's all the more reason why, the women's letters should be consulted by anyone who's seriously interested in the brothers as well.
And it sounds like from your book, I gather there's tens of thousands of letters there that are Caroline's.
Yeah, and some by Lady Spencer, some by Caroline, and it's presumed to be the longest collection of private correspondence in the British Library.
Holy cow! Well,
yeah.
I would like to see those. So let's get the flight started again. I do want to talk more about her in just a second because I want to explore her and her world. But you had mentioned the brother George, the elder brother George, just briefly a moment ago when you were talking about growing up in Massachusetts. And I didn't know much about him, and I was really fascinated about his connection to North America and the significant role that he played in the empire. Can you tell us a little bit about George, and then we'll talk about Caroline in more detail?
Right. Yeah, George was the oldest son, but he was younger than Caroline. She was the big sister. That was her big role in life. And he went he was in the Guards. He served in the War of the Austrian Succession. And he actually distinguished himself as a very junior officer fighting in Italy. There's George. Yeah, that's a portrait believed to be by Reynolds.
Oh, wow.
In the 7 years, he was a mad. If you want to know about George, he was very, very competitive, and he was a mad cricket player, a sportsman, and he loved to hunt. So did Caroline. I think they had a lot in common, actually, Caroline and George. And in the 7 Years' War, the government, the British Army, was interested in Lord Cumberland. The Duke of Cumberland wanted to find a way of introducing light techniques into the British Army in America. The French had more Indian scouts, perhaps better relations with the Indians than the British did. And Indian scouts were absolutely essential in the woods. And so as well as acquiring Indian scouts, there was also an interest in training regular British soldiers in light wilderness techniques. And George had actually seen some of this in his experiences in Europe with irregular fighters there. And so he was sent in 1757 to join Lord Loudon. And he actually went out in service alongside Rogers, the famous Rogers Rangers, who really liked him. And he introduced a lot of their wilderness techniques to a light regiment in the regular army in America. And he was really enthusiastic. He was appearing in the British newspaper at home as, fighting on snowshoes and, fighting out in the wilderness. And, there was this picture that grew of him in the British press of this lord who was willing to endure these very rough and ready conditions alongside his troops. And he was very, very popular with the Americans. But he died in the failed siege of Ticonderoga in July 1758. And which was a massive blow to the family. It was also a blow to the British American Army at that time. And he was so popular that even after the War of Independence, when people went to the town of Ticonderoga, they'd still ask to see the place where he fell. I mean, his popularity kind of outlived the American Revolution. And he, of course, as I mentioned in the book, the colony of Massachusetts paid to have a monument set up for him in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, I remember seeing that for the first time when I went to London, and I was like, "Why is this here?" And this is years ago when I didn't know any better. But it's a remarkable example of just how close British American ties were to the mother country at that point, but particularly venerating someone like Lord Howe at this point, who he died at the vanguard, right, of an assault on Ticonderoga, if I remember correctly.
Yes, he pushed to the front, and actually, it's another example of his kind of overly ambitious. He was only in his early 30s, I have to say, personality. That people criticized Abercrombie and said he should have ordered George to stay behind.
And he's buried in Albany, is that right? In New York?
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, there was a myth that he was buried somewhere up near Ticonderoga, but it's pretty clear that he was buried in a church in Albany. So his body was never returned home. So the Westminster Abbey monument became the family's, monument to him in Britain. Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. And it shows, I mean, it speaks to the connections that the Howes have to British America prior to the American Revolution. I mean, how does the Howe family think about, how do they understand the empire, in the 7 Years' War, but especially post 1763, when it's the great British triumph? It seems like Protestantism is on the ascendancy. The French have been defeated. Things are looking good until they're not. But how do they think about all of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, the Howes weren't statesmen. They didn't write pamphlets. And I noticed, of course, they had these ties with America. William had also served in America. He was at Quebec. His most famous exploit, other than the War of Independence, his infamous exploit, if you want to call it that. His most famous was that he was in the vanguard when Wolfe took Quebec. Of course, he was one of the forlorn hopes who climbed up the cliff and came shouting out on the road and chased the French sentries away. And that was in 1759. So they'd been to America. They were liked by Americans. In terms of the political issues, what's more important than their physical involvement in America and the American environment, really, was their friendship with William Pitt the Elder, the Earl of Chatham, who really was a kind of a mentor for Richard. And of course, Chatham was regarded by the colonists as his great champion. They mistakenly thought that he didn't believe in parliamentary sovereignty, which he certainly did. But he did think that Britain should not exercise it, that the colonies should be left to run their own internal affairs. And he basically agreed with Franklin that it was unfair for the British government to both control colonial trade and be able to lay taxes. And so the Howes as well, adopted the same attitude. And Richard did want to allow the petition of the Stamp Act Congress, for example, to be introduced into Parliament during the Stamp Act troubles. And the Howes and their friends voted against the Massachusetts Government Act, for example. So they were mainstream British statesmen. They did believe in parliamentary sovereignty, but they also thought that it was unwise and unfair to exercise the full authority that, in theory, the British could claim over the colonies. And it was their friendship with Pitt that I think is the touchstone for that.
Well, I just want to remind the audience that you have the opportunity to ask questions of Julie here in just a few moments. So please do submit those in the comments via YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, wherever you're watching us from today. Julie, I want to come back to Caroline because she is a central figure in your book.
Yeah.
As you said, she's the elder sister. She has thousands of letters that still await greater interpretation. Tell us a little bit more about her, and then I have some questions about a pivotal role that she plays in trying to heal the rift between Britain and America in the mid-1770s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Caroline was absolutely the main figure in the book. She's a really, in fact, I'm kind of sorry I've stopped writing about her. She was a really, really likable, interesting person. She had a real personality. She was highly intelligent. And I think, in fact, I noticed that in Rick Atkinson's review of my book, he wrote, Caroline was most likely the brightest of the lot, I think he said. And I think that's it probably is one of these examples where you've got a very, very smart older sister who has to maneuver from behind the scenes because of the restrictions of the time. She was self-educated. She understood French and Italian. She studied Latin. She read very widely. She loved math, which Ben Franklin found a little unusual. She loved chess. She was very competitive. Now, she married someone named John Howe, who was no relative. Then that was why she always kept the name Howe. By the time of the War of Independence, she was a widow, living a few streets down from her brother's house, her brother Richard's house in Grafton Street. But one thing about Caroline was that, I've said that she was involved in politics on behalf of her family. She was probably the most socially skilled of the lot. She was very, very sociable, and a lot of the way she exerted influence was by being so well liked. She wasn't wealthy enough to have a salon as her friend Lady Spencer had, but she did. People came by to play cards with her all the time. Lord Shelburne stopped in, the Cavendish stopped in, so she was very well informed. And in fact, I think that Richard, who in the book I suggest that Richard may have had speech and learning problems. I can't diagnose that, but I think he probably did. And he was kind of reticent, you might even say shy. And I think that Caroline was actually the person who had the best, kind of vital social contacts with people like the Duke of Grafton, people they were allies with in Parliament, Earl Spencer, and actually, interestingly, Lord George Germain, who was running the American Revolution, the War of Independence. He was running the British war effort from London. He and the Howe men really didn't get on very well. But Caroline was great friends with his wife, Lady Diana Lady Diana Germain. So she was actually, she was a better networker than the brothers.
Well, that networking then was crucial to a series of chess games that develops between her and Benjamin Franklin. How did that friendship develop? And then what was the sort of larger motive behind those relationships?
Okay. Franklin. Yeah, these are pictures of Caroline playing chess with Benjamin Franklin. That was a very popular motif in the 19th century. So the first one, Edred Harrison May, is at Yale, and there's a butler standing behind them. And the second one, it's a 19th century picture. I can't locate the artist. So it shows Caroline, Admiral Howe, and Benjamin Franklin in her drawing room having a secret little negotiation around a table.
They're fabulous pictures.
Yeah, but the picture, the image of Caroline playing chess with Ben Franklin, I think that was a very popular. The story was well known in the 19th century. But Benjamin Franklin had, obviously listeners are going to know about the Boston Tea Party. In the wake of the Boston Tea Party, the British government was passing, there was an uproar in London. The British government was passing the Intolerable Acts. And by coincidence, Franklin was due as colony agent for Massachusetts to present a petition asking for the removal of Thomas Hutchinson, the unpopular governor of Massachusetts. And he was due to present this before the Privy Council in late January 1774. Now, he was regarded as a troublemaker, as an instigator of a lot of the problems between Massachusetts in particular and Britain. So it was used as an opportunity to humiliate him. A Solicitor General, Wedderburn, ridiculed him and tore him down to a kind of a laughing audience. And as well as being unpleasant for Franklin, it also meant that at a very key moment in Anglo-American relations, probably one of the best connected Americans in London really couldn't publicly deal with the British government because he'd just been turned into persona non grata. It was really clumsy. So by the autumn of 1774, some members of the cabinet, particularly Lord Dartmouth, were very concerned to try to find some kind of way of pulling back on what looked like a march towards an armed conflict and finding some kind of formula. It didn't even have to be an ultimate solution to the imperial relationship. It could just be something similar to what had happened in the other crises where, things were sort of fudged and the whole thing blew over and, life went on as normal. But something that would get both parties out of the position they were in. So basically, Dartmouth needed a way to approach Ben Franklin entirely secretly. Now, Franklin kept a journal of negotiations in London, which he wrote in March 1775 on his way home from London, of these kind of secret negotiations that ensued, that he was involved in. And this is where Caroline Howe appears as a historical actor. And it's if Franklin hadn't kept this journal, nobody would have ever known about any of this at
Wow.
all. And as I say, she wasn't somebody who talked. So what happened was, effectively in early December 1774, Franklin was approached by Quaker physician Dr. John Fothergill and another Quaker, David Barclay, and they said that there were people in the cabinet who wanted Franklin to try to put together some kind of solution that might be at all acceptable to British statesmen, and it might, quieten patriot leaders. And it was to be all dead secret. And Franklin, he described what went on with these men, but he also said, at about the same time, he was invited to play chess with Caroline Howe. And this was in early December. And on Christmas Day, in December that year, when he was playing chess with Caroline, he was suddenly introduced to Admiral Howe. And they then suggested that he enter into negotiations with them and pitch some ideas. But when Franklin wrote all this down, he said that one thing he didn't understand was that Caroline had invited him to play chess as far back as early November, like a month before Fothergill and Barclay had approached him. And he said, I've got absolutely no idea why she did that, why I received this invitation. He didn't see any connection at the time. And I love the way it's described in his diary. He says he went to the Royal Society, and a man named Matthew Raper, who he didn't know actually was a very good friend of Caroline's, came up to me at the Royal Society. He was a fellow. And he said, there's a certain lady who had a desire of playing with me at chess, fancying she could beat me. And that's typical of Caroline. It's like, I'm sure she really did want to beat him at chess too, by the way, and had requested him to bring me to her. It was, he said, a lady with whose acquaintance he was sure I should be pleased, a sister of Lord Howe's, and he hoped I would not refuse the challenge. And Franklin, well, he was flattered, but then he thought it was a little awkward because he was just supposed to find his way to her house, so he didn't do it. And then after the two Quakers started talking to him, suddenly Matthew Raper appeared again. And this time he said, I'm going to take you to Grafton Street to Mrs. Howe's house. She wasn't going to take no for an answer. So he was brought over and the game started. And he never really understood. But by looking in Caroline's letters, I solved two mysteries. One was Franklin's, and the other is one that historians have puzzled about, because Admiral Howe didn't have any particular connections with Lord Dartmouth. So they've said, why was he patently involved in something that was of interest to Lord Dartmouth? And it's all in Caroline's letters, because in early November 1774, Caroline was visiting Lady Dartmouth. The Dartmouths had an infant daughter who was dying. She did not die, by the way, but they thought she was dying. And Caroline was very close with Lady Dartmouth. She arrived at the house, and this was at the very moment that some of the resolves of the Continental Congress were coming in, and Dartmouth was in despair. He was saying, they're asking for so much, we'll never find common ground. He was in absolute despair at work, and then he was coming home to the sick baby, and into his drawing room came Dr. Fothergill. He was a physician in charge, and Caroline Howe. And it's obvious to me that what happened was they sat down. I mean, Caroline was treated as a dynastic head often by politicians. I mean, for example, Germain invited her to come to his house anytime during the war. He said, stop in anytime for breakfast. You don't need an invitation, and so on and so forth. So he obviously discussed with both of them what's to do about America. And this is what set the Howes going. So Caroline was a connection with Dartmouth. And the reason Franklin got an invitation then was because Caroline wasted no time. She instantly tried to get him to come and play chess with her. And of course, he ignored it. So then a full month later, she sent an invitation he couldn't refuse, as it were.
Golly, that's amazing. Can you tell us a little bit about your process then? Because it sounds like you were finding answers where there were silences in the at least in terms of written letters back and forth, where no one is directly saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to get Franklin to chess, and then we're going to start pitching him on reconciliation efforts. How do you rebuild that world from the evidence you have available to you?
Yeah, a lot of it has to be done by a massive amount of triangulating. You just find out who was where when, and it is painstaking. And I think one of the reasons Caroline's letters are overlooked is because in fact she only mentions Ben Franklin once in her letters.
Really?
Says,
wow.
Yeah, she says to Lady Spencer, I've been playing chess with Dr. Franklin this afternoon, and so she's very, and I think there's a presumption that since she's not directly mentioning a lot of these political and military issues, that she's not involved. But of course, she is involved, and so basically, it involves a lot of very complicated detective work, just uniting different stories told by different people, and as you say, filling in all the gaps. And it actually was kind of fun and exciting. Very detailed work, though.
I bet so. A lot of notepads. You got to make timelines and things like that.
Yeah.
I've got a couple more questions for you, Julie, then we'll turn to some audience questions. But, unfortunately, those negotiations don't pan out, at least unfortunately from the British perspective, and war does ensue. And William and Richard are sent to America, and they make some hay in New York in 1776. What was their relationship like with George Washington? Because it seems to me that they've got a really difficult task. They, at one part, military leader, but also on another part, a kind of diplomacy to at least convince the Americans to back down. And Washington is the head of the Continental Army. How does?
Yeah, and they did try approaching him before they tried approaching the Congress.
Sure.
That's right. But, of course, because Congress had no official standing in their minds and Washington was the head of the army. I think one thing that has to be remembered is that, in wars between foreign countries, particularly in the 18th century, if it looks as if things are going in a certain direction and one side decides, I think we'll start talks with these people, see if they want to surrender, or start feeling around to see if they'll let us surrender on certain terms, you open up diplomacy. But in a rebellion, what do you do? And in some ways, the Peace Commission was a procedure by which the fighting would stop.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is what, that the peace commissioners could be applied to. Certain conditions could be met. Royal government could resume in the colonies, and then some kind of negotiation based around North's conciliatory proposal, which was pretty inadequate, by the way, could then ensue. Other generals, Clinton and Burgoyne, had both talked about the possibility of finding themselves in situations where they were talking to American military leaders. This was just early in the war. What are we going to do if they, because nobody knew how the war was going to go.
Yeah.
If they turn around and say, okay, we're not sure we want to go on with this, what are we to do? And also, I think another thing about the conciliatory, the Peace Commission, is that North really did want to toy around with some ideas and try to come up with something that could broker some kind of long-standing solution to some of the problems without getting too abstract. I don't think he liked abstractions. And I think he'd been happy if, say, leading patriots had been willing to sit down and just throw around some ideas. I think he'd have been quite happy if Richard had managed to do that. And he said that. He said he's not going to ratify anything. He's going to confer. But the Howes did realize that they were going to have to, defeat the American army, which they never did fully to their satisfaction. And they didn't. I really don't think they didn't expect the Americans to simply give up easily. And
Sure.
Richard was not overjoyed with the terms of his peace commission, but he went anyway. I guess because somebody had to do it. His brother was over there. So.
Why not?
Yes. Well, the way things turned out.
Well, Julie, at the end of the day, what do you hope that folks take away from your book? What do you hope that they learn that they may not have known before?
Well, there are a lot of things, but I think one of the things that one of your viewers asked, I feel that in this book, I carved out a narrative about the War of Independence in kind of uncharted territory. Mm-hmm. And I hope that people will see from that by moving away from stories, events, narratives, individuals who who've been gone through over and over, even in cases where historians bring new insights and new material, and opening up kind of uncharted, unknown, even untouched stories and events, that it really can enrich our understanding of how complex these issues are, and the ambiguities around them, and the feelings of the people involved. And I like to think of what I wrote as like Britain's first family. We're always reading about the Adamses and the Jeffersons and the Washingtons. So this is a British first family, and what the War of Independence was like for them, and how they felt about it too.
Well, that's terrific. Well, when this is all over, you can come on over to Mount Vernon. We've got some great maps. Actually, we've got a manuscript map of the New York campaign that was carried by Sir William Erskine. So we'd love to show you some of the features you write about in the book.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah, that would be terrific. But that's enough from me. We've got some audience questions coming in, and actually, Franklin has picked up on a comment you made about Lord Admiral Howe and his potential speech disability, and it gets to the question of sources and reconstruction, and how you might speculate that was the case, and where do we see that in the sources that kind of leads you to think that there was that disability there.
Okay, the reason I think it, and again, I would never, I'm very chary of people trying to diagnose conditions in the past. I think it's a really, really difficult thing to do. But the reason I suspect it strongly is that there were contemporary comments to the effect that Admiral Howe was stupid. People in Parliament saying, God, you can't understand a thing he's saying from the back there, and so on and so forth. And there were also comments from some of the people he served with in the Navy who weren't close to him, saying, I've gotten letters from him that are incomprehensible, or he said things to me that were almost incomprehensible. And in fact, John Adams at the Staten Island conference said, I think he's a little confused in his head. So he got those comments all the time. But he clearly was very intelligent. He was extremely good at what he did. He pioneered a set of signals for use in the Navy that were supposed to supersede the written instructions that people carried into battle, so that British battleships could interact more closely with the flagship. And so I came to the conclusion that in fact there was something standing in the way. And the fact is that there are people who have speech problems where they have a difficulty, they understand things, but they have a difficulty articulating them. And they can also have that problem in writing. And I think that may be why some of his letters were so incomprehensible. I mean, I think Lord Nelson wrote, when he wasn't Lord Nelson, wrote something really kind of cruel. I can't remember the quote now, saying, I got this letter from him it's just the disjuncture between, this man who clearly was intelligent. He understood his environment very well. He was careful. He was orderly, methodical, and these kinds of remarks.
Yeah, it's interesting disjuncture, as you say. On the one hand, people making these comments, but then on the other hand, giving these crucial commands, both in the Navy and then to the peace commissioners to do this work.
Yeah.
So.
And I think if he had speech problems, if his speech was delayed, that would make him more interested in signals, actually.
Sure. Oh, that's a great point. I never even thought about that. That's terrific. Another question coming in is wondering, I think, about Caroline. Did her network extend to any other Americans besides Franklin?
Okay, not that I know of. But I know that the Rockinghams were friends. She was friends with the Rockinghams, and they were friends with a lot of Southern planters who were in London, like Ralph Izard. Yeah. And I think it's possible she may very well have moved in some of their circles, because Admiral Howe did. He knew Ralph Izard and so forth.
Well, there's another avenue for research that somebody out there, or if you want to write the sequel to this book, you've got that thread to follow. Another question coming in is, are there any other major political moments that the Howe family clearly impacted?
Political moments. No, I mean, the Howes really weren't statesmen. Um, the men were men of action, and Caroline was, clearly not able to get directly involved in politics. Um, although you could argue, I mean, Admiral Howe, after he'd retired, was drawn back in to assist with a mutiny. So it may, and he actually resolved a naval mutiny in 1796, I think it was. Sorry, I'm forgetting now. So you could argue that had political ramifications, but I don't, not really. They really weren't political, and that was one thing that made it very different for me to write about them. Mm-hmm. Because I'm used to writing more about political figures, and they didn't write pamphlets, or, well, if they did, they wrote very brief pamphlets, and they didn't really give towering speeches or anything like that.
It seems like then their influence was much more in the social realm, or using connections to affect potential policy outcomes, or at least gathering information. It sounds like, at least on Caroline's side,
military policy and things. Yeah,
certainly.
Yeah, introducing new military techniques and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And a third question we've got is, what surprised you most while researching this book?
Oh, wow. That's quite a question.
We can do 2 or 3.
2 or 3 surprises?
Yeah.
I think I really was surprised at, what I've been talking about, the number of things in Caroline's letters that added up to other things that were known about the brothers or events at the time. And it really makes me realize that when people try to look at, for example, military figures in a vacuum, and they compartmentalize their personal life mm-hmm. from their professional life, they're probably missing a lot. Really a lot. It's not just backdrop or let's get to know Wellington as a person, that kind of thing. They're actually missing out on motivations, how much the person actually knew when they made certain decisions, all kinds of things. So I was surprised at how much I found out about Franklin's secret negotiations from Caroline's letters. She was a very dynamic person.
What's next for you then? Are you thinking about following Caroline further, or have you already got your sights set on another set of historical problems we don't have satisfactory answers to?
It would be tempting to follow Caroline further. I have to admit, it really would. And I haven't made up my mind about that yet. Or maybe go into other uncharted territory. But no, I don't know. It is tempting, and I have thought about writing about her friendship with Lady Spencer in more depth, because that was a very interesting relationship.
I guess we'll just have to stay tuned then.
Yeah.
Well, Julie, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Well, I've really enjoyed it. And, I very much appreciate everyone's interest in the book, and I hope they enjoy it. And please, I have a website. If you have any questions, feel free. I love to answer questions, and I'll be glad to hear from people.
And what's your website, Julie, just so people can find you?
Just type in julieflavell.com and you're there.
Easy enough.
Good.
Yeah, well, thanks again. And thank you very much to all the folks out there in the audience. We appreciate you spending some time with us today. And thanks to Samantha Snyder and Jeanette Patrick, who are behind the scenes, helping the production to run smoothly. And Julie, thanks again. And please do come and see us.
Tim?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you show the final picture? Caroline in her 90s.
Oh, absolutely. That's a nice way to end it. Yeah.
It's the only portrait that survived of Caroline. She's got the Times, which had only just started coming out around then.
And very appropriately, it looks like she's got a piece of paper and a pen right there.
Exactly.
As well.
Okay.
Well, that's a great way to end it. Thank you, Julie.
Okay. Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.